Joining us is Dr. Dwayne Elmore, Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology. Now, Dwayne, we're in a cross timbers habitat, and a lot of my viewers live in areas similar to this. I'm sure there's things we can do to manage this in a way to bring wildlife into our landscapes. What are some tips we can look at?
Well, you know, one of the things about the cross timbers forest is that a lot of it has been fire excluded for a long time. So it tends to have a closed canopy and not much of a herbaceous understory, which is fine for some wildlife species, but others like white-tailed deer, wild turkey, northern bobwhite, they really need that herbaceous understory. So what you want to do if you're trying to create that is to open up the forest canopy. And rather than eliminating the forest, just create some forest gaps.
Okay. And we're in a research area where we have on one side of us an unmanaged, this is probably the typical of what we see, but behind me over here is an area that you've started managing. And here we have the oaks still standing. You've worked on thinning them out. There's a lot of different ways we could go about doing that, right?
Yeah, and it really depends on the site and what options you have. You know, fire is a great tool, and historically that's what would have kept the forest in a more open state. But if you're in a residential area, that may not be an option. So you can look at things like just cutting the trees or using herbicide perhaps.
We could girdle those as well so that they die but they're left standing.
Yes.
And that's another decision that the homeowner would have to make. Do they want to leave standing trees or would that pose some sort of hazard?
Yeah, snags or standing dead trees are really important for some species of wildlife like woodpeckers, but you know, they also can present a risk if they're near a home or where someone walks. So you just have to decide, you know, is it a safe place to have that? And you know, a lot of it, the aesthetics will depend on the person. You know, I personally like a few snags, but you know, I'm really interested in wildlife. But it's certainly a good practice to leave some of them standing, and they're going to provide habitat for cavity nesting birds.
Tell me a bit about the understory and how that changes when you get in there and thin the canopy.
So it's all about sunlight. When in these really close canopy cross timber forests, we just don't have much sunlight. And we also have accumulation of leaf litter, which inhibits a lot of the herbaceous plants. So if you create gaps in the canopy, you're going to get more grasses and forbs and vines that can take advantage of that sunlight. And that'll just change the type of wildlife that might use that site.
So on this side, we have a lot of the chasmanthium, the big grass in the forest. I see some pokeweed. Of course, we have our buckbrush. What kind of wildlife are we going to draw over here?
Oh, this is going to be really good for white-tailed deer and wild turkey. There's a lot of vines and forbs in here that deer will use for forage throughout the year. There's also more nesting cover for birds like turkey that need some type of you know, herbaceous cover or shrub layer for nesting. And it's even getting open enough that you might start to see a few bobwhite, but it really needs to be more open for that. But the important thing is here, you know, we were not interested in trying to eliminate this forest. I mean, this is supposed to be cross timber forest, and it's an important ecosystem. But just by removing some of the trees selectively, we've really changed the understory and increased the productivity for certain wildlife species. But the unmanaged portion is also important for some wildlife. You know, having that deep leaf litter, there are certain bird species that nest in that. So, you know, my recommendation if you have large acreage is just to do different things. You know, have some areas that are more open and some areas that are more closed. Another
part that especially a lot of homeowners are going to have is that edge where the woods kind of end and the landscape begins. And our human nature is to clean that up and make it look tidy.
Yeah, I mean, people always say, you know, they don't want it to look snaky. Well, snaky is good for wildlife, lots of wildlife. So this edge area where it's grown up with vines, things like greenbrier, Virginia creeper, that is a really important area. There's lots of birds that actually nest in that or use those vines for winter cover. Also, those vines are really important forage for white-tailed deer. So, you know, if you can tolerate it, resist the urge to clean everything up and have some biomass out there for wildlife.
One last area, and we have a bit down the way, is when we get those little bit of openings. Let's go look at how we can manage that. Well, Dwayne, the cross timbers has these characteristic openings that actually support tallgrass prairie. What do we want to think about? What does this offer for wildlife, and how do we want to manage it?
Yeah, you can actually get grassland species show up in the cross timbers in these grassy openings, which range in size. Some can be quite large. So it really adds to not only the wildlife diversity, but the plant diversity in those forests.
And we get the grasses, but there'll also be a number of flowering plants that come up in there. So we get a really beautiful habitat that also supports a great diversity of wildlife.
Absolutely.
Now, as you look across the state, we see a lot of this habitat turn into this. We get all those cedars coming in.
Yeah, if you don't manage those grassy openings in the cross timbers, and even the cross timbers themselves, you get juniper encroachment, which is a native plant, but historically it wasn't as common as what we see now. And so you get those openings become juniper woodland, and that completely changes the flora and the fauna of that site. You know, we lose the grass, and then we lose the grassland species, wildlife.
And so since this is such a common landscape in Oklahoma, we probably want to try to manage for the open grassland.
Yeah, we've got plenty of juniper.
How do we go about maintaining that?
If you're in a residential setting, the easiest way is to clip those cedar, or you can periodically mow the area. You know, ideally you would want to burn that because you get a lot more flowering plants and just a different response. But if you're in an area where that's not an option, you know, at minimum try to keep those juniper clipped out.
Okay. Well, Dwayne, I think it's wonderful to encourage people who have these habitats to try to encourage the wildlife. I'm sure their habitat's disappearing and they can use all the help they can get.
You bet.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.